I will finally be able to tell you about Campbell's theory of the sense of a perceptual demonstrative. So the first part is that attention to the referent is required to understand a perceptual demonstrative. This is the first part of Campbell's view. So in order to give some intuitive support for this claim that attention to an object is required to understand a perceptual demonstrative, here are two passages. So the first passage is from very old, from philosopher G.E. Moore. So this was actually from not 1962, this is a reprint, I think, but this is actually from the turn of the last century, so around the same time as Russell and Frege, and it's a very old insight, and it's captured in the following passage. Can we say that thing equals the thing at which I'm pointing, or the thing to which this finger points, or the nearest thing to which this finger points? No, because the proposition is not understood unless the thing in question is seen. So what is happening in this passage? Well, Moore is inviting us to consider, imagine someone, you're talking to someone and that person points at something and says, that thing. Okay, so that, and perhaps the person says, that thing is my favorite, or that thing is green, whatever. Okay, so this person you're talking to uses the demonstrative that thing and points to something. Now, suppose that instead of following the person's pointing and looking at the thing, instead of doing that, you form in your head the following description in trying to interpret the person's utterance. So the person says that thing, and in the head you think, okay, in your head you think, okay, the thing at which the person's pointing at, or the thing to which the person's finger points, something like that. Now, the idea is that in interpreting the person's utterance, for instance, in the person saying that thing is green, you don't actually understand what the person is saying if you think, for instance, oh, the thing at which the speaker is pointing at is green. Rather, you only actually understand what the person is saying if you actually look at what the person is pointing at and actually look and attend at the object and think, oh, that thing, that object is green. Okay, so the idea is that in interpreting a perceptual demonstrative, you can actually form various descriptions to understand it. So for instance, the thing at which the speaker is pointing. Rather, in order to understand a speaker's demonstrative, you have to look at the thing they're talking about. So you have to attend to it, okay? So this intuition that merely forming descriptions is not sufficient for understanding supports the view that actually what's required for understanding a perceptual demonstrative is that you see the thing that the person is pointing at. Okay. Now another example is from Campbell, and this is from his book, 2002 book, in which he elaborates the ideas from the article that we are reading this week. And his example, this is called the Sea of Faces example. So I'm going to read it to you. So you and I are sitting at a dinner table with a large number of people around, and you make a remark to me about that woman. So you use the perceptual demonstrative, that woman. There are a lot of people around. I can't yet visually single out which one you mean. So, on anyone's account, I do not yet know which woman you're talking about. So the idea is that we're sitting at a dinner table, and there's many different people around us, okay? And you say to me something about that woman. You use the demonstrative, that woman. Now, intuitively, in order for me to understand what you're saying, I have to visually single out from among all these people in front of us the woman that you're talking about. Okay? So, but imagine instead of me visually singling that, before I visually single out that person, my visual experience is of a sea of faces, okay? So the idea is that all you see in front of you are just a whole bunch of different faces, okay? And none of them are being consciously singled out by your attention, okay? So the woman who you're talking about might be in this sea of faces in my experience. But even if it's there, that doesn't mean that I'm able to understand what you're saying. In order for me to actually understand what you're saying, what I have to do is inspect this sea of faces and identify with my attention the face of the woman, or the woman that you're talking about, okay? So he concludes, so long as my conscious experience remains a sea of faces, there is an ordinary sense in which I do not know who you mean, okay? So in order for me to, the intuition in this dinner table example with the sea of faces is that you have to consciously single out with your visual attention the object that is the referent of a perceptual demonstrative in order to understand it. Okay, so this sea of faces example and this insight from Moore provide some intuitive support for the claim that attention is required to understand a perceptual demonstrative. Okay, so now in addition to relying on intuitions, now I'm going to present to you the kind of master argument, or the theoretical argument from Campbell's book for his view that attention is necessary for understanding perceptual demonstratives. Okay, so this argument is made more clearly in his 2002 book, which is a follow-up to the paper, and hopefully running through this argument will help you understand more clearly the view that he is making in the paper. Okay, so the first premise is as follows. For a subject to understand a perceptual demonstrative, she must know which object the demonstrative picks out. Okay, so recall, to motivate this principle, recall Russell's principle of acquaintance, which we saw in the readings in the second lecture. So that means, so for Russell, understanding an expression is to know what it refers to. And so this idea here is just a version of that principle, which is that to understand a perceptual demonstrative, you have to know which object the demonstrative picks out. Okay. Now the second premise is as follows. For a subject to know which object a demonstrative picks out is for her to be in a mental state that causes and justifies the ways she uses that demonstrative. Okay? So ignore the word concept here, okay? What this premise says is that for a subject to know which object a perceptual demonstrative picks out is for her to be in a mental state that causes and justifies the way she uses that demonstrative. So let me elaborate this. What is a way of using a demonstrative? So a way of using a demonstrative involves particular procedures for verifying and finding the implications of propositions involving it. Okay, so these activities of verifying and finding implications are done to discover truths about the referent or act on it. So suppose, for instance, that there is a glass on the table in front of you, and someone asks you, what is in that glass? Okay, and then you go about answering. Okay, now in order to find an answer to that question, what is in that glass? Okay, you will do certain things. So for example, you'll pick it up and look at it, and maybe you'll taste the liquid that's inside, or maybe just by looking at it, it's obvious that it's water. Okay, so there's specific things you do in order to verify the answer to the question what's in that glass will be caused and justified by your grasp of the demonstrative of that glass. So the person asks you, what is in that glass? Okay, and in answering that question, in verifying an answer to that question, you'll be deploying your understanding of the demonstrative of that glass. Okay, so um, you'll attend to it, and you'll be able to, on the basis of your attention to the object, discover, for instance, what's inside. And it's not just discovering truths about the thing, but also acting on it. So, for example, if someone asks you, can you pass me that glass? Your attention to the glass will cause and justify the way in which your arm moves to pick it up. Okay, so you looking at the thing will be what guides you in acting on it. So it's your attention to the glass, to the referent of the demonstrative of that glass, that causes and justifies the way in which you go about acting on it. Okay, so it's by attending to it that you're able to guide your hand towards finding and grabbing it and manipulating it. Okay, so this idea of how we discover truths or act on things is caused and justified by our attention to them when we're thinking about demonstratives. This leads into the third premise, which is that conscious attention to an object just is that mental state that causes and justifies the way the subject uses the demonstrative. Okay? So again, premise 2 says, what it means to know what object a perceptual demonstrative picks out involves you being in a mental state that causes and justifies the ways you use that demonstrative. And then premise 3 says, what that mental state is that causes and justifies the ways that you use a demonstrative, that mental state is our conscious attention to an object. Okay? So by premises 2 and 3, we can put them together to say that if a subject knows which object a perceptual demonstrative picks out, she's in a state of conscious attention to the object. And then we put together this subconclusion 4 with the first premise, which is that knowing what object is in question is required to understand a perceptual demonstrative. Putting together that premise with the fourth subconclusion, we get the conclusion that for a subject to grasp a perceptual demonstrative, she must have conscious visual attention to the object. And this is the core of Campbell's view, and I have just given you the master argument for the view. Okay, now I'm going to return now to premise 3, which is that the claim that conscious attention to an object is the mental state that causes and justifies the way a subject uses a perceptual demonstrative. And in illustration of that claim, I'm going to go over a couple more things from cognitive science to illustrate why this might be true. Okay, so we saw some intuitive reasons here why it's true that conscious attention is what causes and justifies. So for example, if someone asks you what's in that glass, your attention to that glass, okay, will be what causes and justifies your particular answer. And also if someone asks you to pass that glass, your attention to it will cause and justify how it is that you go about grabbing the object and passing it. And but there's some other examples of how attention causes and justifies ways of interacting or gaining information about objects from cognitive science. So in cognitive science, there's different proposals for how it is that our visual system determines whether certain objects are inside another object or whether certain objects are enclosed. Okay, so when we come to have experience of the world, our experience presents various objects as standing in various relations to each other. So we'll see that an object as enclosed in another object. And so one thing that cognitive scientists do is think about what it is, what are the procedures, what are the algorithms that the visual system employs in order to determine whether an object is enclosed. Okay. And then, so one very simple method is called the ray intersection method. And this method holds that to determine whether a location is inside some object, what you do is you draw a line starting from the location, and then you decide if it's enclosed just in case that line intersects a surface an odd number of times. So how does this algorithm work? Okay, so look at this figure here. So we look at this location, and now we want to determine whether this location is enclosed or not. So what we do is we start drawing a line, and we notice that the line intersects a surface once. And 1 is an odd number, so we conclude that the line is enclosed, which is true. Okay, so this method of determining whether this is enclosed or not works in this case, where we start at this location and we draw a line, and the line intersects a surface only once, an odd number, so we can infer that it's enclosed. Now we're wondering if this location is enclosed or not. So we start, and then we draw a line. Now we notice that the line that we've drawn actually intersects a surface 2 times. So it intersects here and then again here. And 2 is not an odd number, it is an even number. So we conclude following this method, we conclude that the location is not enclosed, which is correct. Okay, so the ray intersection method, this example illustrates why the ray intersection method might be a plausible way in which our visual system can have a method or an algorithm for determining whether something is enclosed or not. Okay, in this example, in this figure on the right, we see some problems with this method. So we see that this method is too simple. So for example here, if we start drawing a line, we intersect once and we intersect another surface. So we intersect 2 surfaces. So according to this method, this is not enclosed, but it is. According to this method, this one is enclosed. According to the ray intersection method, this location is enclosed, but it's not. So there's another bad prediction for this method, okay? So there's a slightly more advanced method which proposes that what you do is you select the location, then you begin coloring in kind of circles out from the location, bigger and bigger. So you begin coloring more and more. And what you're going to do is you're going to stop coloring when you hit a surface, okay? And what this method says is that the location is enclosed just in case the coloring process stops inside the visual field. So here we have this location, then we start coloring, and we're going to stop inside the visual field because we'll stop inside the shape. And so this coloring method will say that this is enclosed, which is correct. We'll get a similar good prediction for here because we'll start coloring and we won't stop at the visual field. So we'll keep on going. So this method says that this is not enclosed, which is correct. And this method, you can check, is a bit better for these cases. Okay, so for instance, if you start coloring, you will stop inside here. So the region coloring method explains how you can determine this is enclosed, but the ray intersection doesn't work with this. And then the region coloring method also works here because you'll start coloring and then you'll go outside of the visual field. So this will say that it's not enclosed, which is correct, okay? But the point that I'm going through these things, the reason I'm going through these different methods is that in each of these methods, what you do, the first part of the method is that you select a location. And the location is a starting point for the things you do to determine whether the location is enclosed or not, okay? And so this is an illustration of the idea that it's your attention to a location that is it causes and justifies the way that you think about things, okay? So in elaborating premise 3 here, we can understand how it is exactly that Campbell actually relies on Treisman's view of attention to a perceived location as being the thing that binds together features and allows us to perceive and think about objects. Okay, so if attention works according to Treisman's model, then we can say that two perceptual demonstratives share a sense just in case they are understood, the demonstrative is understood, in virtue of the subject's attention selecting the same location as the feature binding parameter. Okay, so this proposal, Campbell's proposal, following Treisman, is that what the sense is sameness of perceived location being used. The same sense comes from the same perceived location being used to bind together features. Okay, so if it's true that conscious attention to an object happens in virtue of your attention selecting a location, and on the basis of that location binding together the properties as of a single object, then we can say, then Campbell says, according to that model, we can say that the sense of a perceptual demonstrative is the perceived location that's used in binding together the features of a single object. So now, if we recall the case from the beginning with the two trees, the tree which you see the different branches of out of the different windows, we can now explain why it is that in this case why it is in the case where you point to out the same window in each case, why it is that that's valid, but why it is that this is not valid. And the reason is that, according to Campbell's view, all of these three demonstratives will share a sense, because the idea is the demonstratives are used according to the same perceived location, because you're pointing at the same place. So according to Campbell's view, where the perceived location is what provides the sense, these three demonstratives will share a sense. And it's because these three demonstratives share a sense is that you can infer, or you can trade on identity, and you don't need an additional identity premise. But in beta, because for this, the demonstrative in the second sentence is using a different perceived location as the location parameter, because you're pointing at a different place, you're pointing at the right window. Okay? And because of that, these two demonstratives do not share a sense, according to Campbell's view. And because these two demonstratives do not share a sense, in order for this inference to be valid, you have to add an identity premise. Okay? Whereas when you have sameness of sense and in virtue of the same perceived location, you have the ability to infer, to collect together the information without adding an explicit identity premise. Okay, so that is how Campbell can explain his contrasts in which inferences are licensed in terms of the sense, the sameness or difference of sense of the demonstrative, by relying on the cognitive science model of perceived location as binding together features of objects.